So now let's talk about Lambda functions. In the Python world, Lambda functions are called anonymous functions. So we've talked about functions before, and we've talked about how to create functions, right? You use def to define a function, space, whatever the function name is, parentheses, whether it's going to accept variables or not, and then the rest of the function. I've shown you how to call a function, how to send variable values to the function, and the whole 9 yards, right? So the important thing to understand about functions is that they're supposed to be reusable components of code, blocks of code. The idea is you're going to create that function, and then throughout your code you can simply make a call to that function in order to get whatever resources the function is going to offer. Well, one of the things that you run into with Python sometimes is, what about if you need to process some data? What if you need to do some function-y like stuff, but you don't want to go through making an actual function, declaring an actual function? And that is where Lambda functions can come in. Basically, these are what are called anonymous functions, and essentially they give you the power of a function in a little bit easier to write format. So let's take a look at an example of a Lambda function. So we have this little script here, and basically what we want to do is we want to add num1 and num2 together in order to get a value back. So imagine if you have a script, and again, you just want to do some very basic math in the script. You don't want to go through making a big old function. That is where this little Lambda function and anonymous function comes in. So we have num1 equals 1, num2 equals 2. That's basically just creating and assigning values to the variables. Down here we're going to have response equals, and we're going to have an equal lamb. So this is for the Lambda function, and we are going to then send num1 and num2 to this Lambda function. Now you'll notice here, basically what we're doing is we're creating a Lambda function and assigning that as a value to a variable. So basically you're calling this, but it's more like calling a variable than a function in a way. Anyways, when you have the Lambda function, what you're going to do is you're going to start with the word lambda. Lambda says, do something. Then after you declare lambda, then you are going to put in basically the variables that are supposed to be submitted to this lambda function. So num1, comma num2, num2. So these are the two variables that are being sent to this lambda function with their values. Then basically what we're going to do is we're going to put a colon here, and this is where we say what we are going to do in this lambda function. What are we doing here? And so what we're going to do is we're going to say num1 plus num2, so that is the action that we are taking, and so we are then going to assign that value back to lamb, which then gets assigned back to response, and then we print the response out. So with the lambda function, you start with the word lambda, you then put in what variables are expected to come into this lambda function. You do a colon, and then you say what you want this lambda function to do, num1 plus num2, num1 minus num2, num1 times num2, num1, you get the point, right? Whatever that is, will get assigned here, which will then go back to response, and then we are going to print out the response, and that is when we are going to get the answer of, 3, right? Really exciting. But basically, this is the concept of what a lambda function can do. Now here's another example of a lambda function. So basically what we're going to be looking for here is the @ symbol in this string? Basically, is one word in a different string? If it is, say yes. If it isn't, say no. So let's say we're trying to parse through strings, and we're trying to see if something has something like an email address in it. It's just a very easy way to go through, and basically, are there any @ symbols in this string? Basically say yes or no. So we have x equals the @ symbol there, y equals bob@aol.com. Down here we have answer equals is in x. So is in is the lambda function, and we are sending the value of x to the lambda function. So here's another example of a lambda function. Basically here, what we're going to be asking for is one substring within another string? So we're going to be asking, is there an @ symbol within this string? So let's say we're parsing through text, and we just very quickly want to see if something might be an email address or not. Basically, that's all we're doing here. We then have this if else statement here. Basically, if x, if at, NY, bob@aol.com. Basically, the answer is yes, else the answer is no. So this is what an if-else statement is going to look like in the Lambda world. Basically here we have Lambda, x comma y, colon, like we had before, and then we had this statement. We have answer equals is in, so this is the variable name. We're sending in x, we're sending in y, right? So Lambda, x, y, and then we're going to compare the substring and the string. And then we are simply going to print the answer out here. When we print the answer, we're going to see that the answer is in fact yes. There is an @ symbol in bob@aol.com, right? If we go here and let's say this is a number, 111-222-3333, and we go and we run this, we will see it answers no, because there is no @ in that telephone number, because it's a telephone number. So this is an example of a Lambda function where basically, again, this is where we're basically seeing if a substring is within a string. We're using an if-else statement, so yes if x and y, else no. Now here's an example of using a Lambda function in line. So basically we're just going to run this anonymous function and we are going to print the response out here. Again, the same thing, and we have bob@aol.com, but now we don't have those additional variables here. Basically we are just going to print out the results. So again, you have the parentheses to open up a print command, then you have parentheses to open up the Lambda function here. And then over here, you have the x and the y values that are going to be submitted to the Lambda function. So x and y are here. In order to submit these values to the Lambda function, you have this set over here, so x comma y. Then we're going to do Lambda, x comma y, colon, yes if x and y, else no. So basically the idea here is this is all just simply in line. You're doing a little bit of processing. Again, you don't want that big old complicated function to be dealing with, no. And so if we run this again, as we know, the answer is yes, because it is always yes. And so this is another example of a Lambda function. So that's a basic idea of what a Lambda function is. So basically, again, it's an anonymous function. The idea is you want the power of a function. You just don't want all the complication of defining a function, the whole 9 yards. Basically, this is kind of like a one-off event that's going to happen in your script. You need to do a little bit of processing, so you just do it in this Lambda function, and then, you know, your script continues on. You're not going to be using this functionality throughout the rest of your script. Again, it's basically the idea is it's a one-off occurrence. When you do this, again, you start with Lambda essentially as the keyword. You then say what variables are going to be put into the Lambda function, again, like num1 or num2, whatever else. You then do colon to define where the function begins, and then on the other side, that's where you have the function. Again, you can have some basic math stuff there. You can have some if-else statements, the whole 9 yards. This is a place where ChatGPT can be very good for you. If you want to play around with some Lambda functions, you want to understand a little bit better about how the Lambda functions can be used, again, for things like if-else statements, that type of thing. Literally just asking ChatGPT. They can spit out a lot of different versions of these things for you so you can see it better. Lambda functions are one of those that they're relatively easy, but until you start using them, they can seem a bit confusing. And the more important thing is to understand where you should be using them at. That can be a bit of a curious thing. Again, do remember when you're writing code, you can do things technically correctly. Your code works perfectly, but it's a mess to read. And so that's one of the things to consider as you're using Lambda functions, whether you use a normal function or whether you use a Lambda function. One of the things to be considering is how easy is this going to read? The next person that gets my code, will they understand what I'm trying to accomplish, or would it be better just to write a little bit longer function so that people understand what's going on? So anyways, this is the idea with Lambda functions. We will have some labs so you understand this concept better. Again, it's just one of those things. Play with it, and it gets easier as it goes.